So the way that I want to structure this is I have material that I would like to present, and then we can have discussion, participation, and any sort of comments. But if I'm saying something completely nonsensical and you feel like there's a need to interrupt and correct, by all means do. But in general, I just want to be able to get through the material, because otherwise I might get very confused and lost, and that would not be very good. And again, I want to say thank you to Poni-Radio.ru and Morwaen in particular, and actually the entire team of Poni-Radio history podcasts. This podcast is completely inspired by their historical series. It's structured to follow their structure, and I'm taking a lot of the material from Morwaen with his permission. So in advance, I want to thank them for allowing me to do this in English language. The original podcast is actually done in Russian, so it's not generally available to the English-speaking audience. Okay, so as I was saying, I want to start at the beginning of before humanity was humanity, and slowly, very slowly progress through space and time all around the globe, and stopping probably right prior to World War II, because that's modern politics. And modern politics is something I don't really want to mess with. And as a disclaimer, everything I express here is a personal interpretation of known scientific information, and it is my opinion. I'm not going to continuously repeat that it is my opinion. It's also in part Morwaen's opinion, an opinion of those scientists whose material I'm basing my information on. But I am going to try to stick as close as possible to science here, and as far as possible from various other alternative history theories. We can reserve those for discussion or for special episodes if we want to do that. So today I want to cover basically the period from before there was humanity as such, as we understand it today, to the period when humanity became humanity. And I want to stop before we get to Neanderthals, because I think Neanderthals deserve their entirely own podcast. They're quite special and unique parallel humanity, alternative humanity, that I think have not enough coverage. Well, they have a lot of coverage, but a lot of it's negative. So another thing that I just want to disclose right away is that I'm not going to touch the subjects of people's religious beliefs here. I think that that's completely outside of the scope of this particular podcast. I'm not going to argue evolution versus creation. For the sake of this podcast and just for my convenience, we're going to assume that even if there was such thing as creation, it happened at some point in time before humans became what we consider to be an anatomically modern humans. So, and I'm going to cover on some very basic concepts here, just in case somebody watching this may not be familiar with these. If I'm going over material that you already know well, let me get through it. It will be pretty fast. So humans, first and foremost, it is a common misconception that humans evolved from apes. That is not true. Humans did not evolve from apes. Apes and humans both evolved from a common ancestor. That the last common ancestor between chimpanzees and humans was anywhere between 8 to 6 million years ago. And so both species have been evolving continuously for that duration of time and have changed quite a bit comparing to the original ancestor. So no, we are not monkeys, literally. We do not have tails, but we do share a lot and have a lot in common with a lot of the different ape species, some more than others. And actually, a fact that most people don't really think of and don't consider is, in a way, chimps are far more advanced and more evolved today than humans are comparing to their ancestors, because chimps, comparatively to humans, have acquired a lot more adaptive traits that allow them to survive well in their environment. The same can be said for gorillas or for orangutans. Their evolution has been quite unique and quite specialized for them. And if it was a chimp doing this podcast right now and not me, we probably would be discussing, the relatively unsuccessful human evolution comparing to the successes that the chimps have acquired in adapting to their environment. Or if it was a dolphin, we would probably be discussing advances in echolocation and swimming and the strange humans who have pretty much remained on shore today. So that being said, I'm sure everybody has heard about Lucy, who lived about 2 million years ago and, belonged to the Australopithecus. Now, there were two types of Australopithecus. There was the gracile ones, which were the small, skinny, and very elegant ones. And then there were the robust ones, who were pretty much the big, heavy, scary looking. So, Australopithecus. So the first creature that is the closest thing to being our ancestor, is considered right now to be Homo habilis. apes with big monkey faces, very big jaws, and very pronounced sexual dimorphism. There's sexual dimorphism being the difference between the size of the male and a female in a group. If you think about a gorilla, the big silverback gorilla male, he's huge, and he just kind of sits there and he doesn't really need to do much of anything. Where all the other smaller gorillas, they're not even necessarily afraid of him, though they can be, as much as they defer to him for protection. And that dimorphism is what allows him to have multiple mates and to dominate the group. So there's some evidence that Homo habilis still had very pronounced sexual dimorphism, to where the males were about 1.5 times the size of the females. Now, their teeth, and specifically their canine teeth, were significantly smaller than of their ancestors, Australopithecus. And the size of the canine teeth is oftentimes an indication of levels of aggression within the group. The larger the teeth, the more likely there is serious tension and aggression going on within the group. The smaller the teeth, the more well-adapted the group members tend to be. And that's very general correlation, but as a kind of a guideline, that's something that anthropologists do look at. So these creatures, they lived in Eastern and Southern Africa. Sometimes they group together with the Australopithecus. Those, the majority of scientists do put them in a separate group. Their skull, their head formation is not, they had a little bit more round and the larger space for the brain, not significantly larger. They had smaller jaws comparing to their predecessors. And again, their teeth were smaller. So general tendency that people have today to have smallish teeth started appearing right then and there. And their hands were not particularly good for grasping, even though they're called, Homo habilis, which means basically Homo skillful or skilled. They were not very skilled because they couldn't grasp things very well. So, and their brain size was not much different from modern chimps, at about 500 grams. So I'm going to more or less skip over Homo ergaster. I'm just going to say that that's considered to be ancestral group to the Homo erectus, which we're going to go about in much further detail. But they were the first ones who developed larger brains, taller, lankier bodies, and severe, they were using tools that were far more advanced comparing to the tools that the previous Homo species used. Okay, so Homo erectus is really your first creature that I would consider to be human in our sense. I mean, I don't know if he would be able to operate. He probably would be able to operate a computer. I doubt he would be able to write a software code for it, but, probably your average 13-year-old, 14-year-old, about the same self-control. There is good evidence that they might have had speech. At least some scientists consider the fact that they might have had rudimentary speech. I personally, in my opinion, believe that they probably did have some sort of form of communication. And there's some evidence also that they were able to use some sort of flotation devices. And this might come as a surprise to a lot of people. I mean, they already had a tool complex. They definitely had family care, and they definitely cared for their own. They definitely had, differentiated tools to where they would have one tool for one purpose and a different tool for another purpose. They definitely already had all the modern human features in the sense of their feet, their hands, their brain capacity, like I said, was getting pretty close to modern human. And they managed to cross certain areas of the ocean, seas, and rivers that probably would not be feasible to do if they did not have some sort of flotation device. Now, generally, scientists tend to be very careful about that, but when we find their remains on various islands of Europe that never been connected to the continent, it's interesting to think about how those populations got there, because, if there's a couple of you and you're stranded on some floating tree log, chances are you're not going to be able to reproduce very well. So either a lot of people had to be stranded on floating tree logs many, many times and all managed to wind up in the same place together, or chances are they did know how to use flotation, at least in a primitive sense. So they have been found all over Europe, Africa, Asia, China. And there's many, many different variations of them. I mean, this is a species, or if you want to call it a group of species, that are very variable. They are the ones who really got out of Africa and managed to colonize a lot of modern territories. Indonesia to Spain. And they mostly remained in the warmer climates. They were not so fond of the colder climates. So, and I want to get to the Dmanisi case because I think it's very interesting and it's not very well known. Dmanisi was a castle, and it's in the country of Georgia, which was formerly part of Soviet Union, but now is a very proud, independent country, and as it rightfully should be. And so there was an ancient castle there, and archaeologists, local archaeologists, right before the Soviet Union decided to fall apart, were in the process of excavating this. It was Middle Ages castle. It was interesting enough, and they started lifting up the floor, the mosaics on the floor, and under the floorboards they found skeletons. And lo and behold, it turned out that those skeletons were apparently a lot older than the castle that they were excavating. So teams of scientists were called in, and these specimens that were preserved in a very, very good condition were studied extensively, and they still are. Now, what we have there is a family. So it was a family inside a cave where some sort of a disaster, most likely a flash flood, happened, and the entire family pretty much got killed right there on the spot. So we actually have a slice of the entire population of one little group. And that's a pretty good indicator what size those groups were at first when those humans first started dispersing out of Africa. I mean, they were no more than 20 individuals, more often significantly less. Like this group is of 5 individuals, and it has everything from a teenager who, interestingly enough, had a very bad habit. He liked to pick between his teeth. He must have had a toothache, and he really liked to clean between his teeth. He made a toothpick out of some sort of a branch, and he picked at his teeth, and he picked at his teeth, and he picked at his teeth until his entire lower jaw was pretty much. So people, brushing your teeth is really good for you. Don't get overzealous with it, because otherwise you might wind up like this young man. I'm sure he was not feeling very well at the time of death. There's a female there and a male there, adults. The male and the female are very different in appearance. The female is much more human-like in the sense that she has a smaller face, she has smaller teeth. She's, if you saw her on the street today, you probably would not be terribly taken aback. To where the gentleman is far more robust. And by robust, again, I mean rougher, more pronounced features, the eyebrows, ridge, and everything else like that. So he was much more primitive in his appearance. He was also significantly larger than the female. But one of the members of the group was particularly interesting because by the way, these are most likely Homo erectuses. Actually, they're not even anything more advanced than their early Homo erectuses. Now, Dmanisi is in Georgia. That's Caucasus Mountains. So this group must have migrated, well, not this specific group, but a group that they originated from must have left Africa, very long time ago, because they couldn't exactly jump on an airplane and fly from point A to point B. So it took them a significant amount of time to get there. So the group they originated from must have been much more archaic than some of the later erectuses we find in different parts of the world. And this group is not one of our ancestors. Most likely that population got wiped out. There was several volcanic eruptions between time period when these individuals lived and present. But the most interesting thing about that group is the bone skull that they found, and the skull belonged to a very old individual. It was either grandma, grandpa. The individual was so old that in our years, his or her age would pretty much be considered right around 80 years old. He had no teeth. We're just going to call him grandpa because we still don't know the actual gender of the skull, but grandpa had no teeth, and he has not had any teeth for so long that bone formed over them and grew over. He had a lot of other disabilities. This guy was old, he was very disabled, and most importantly, he could not chew for himself, which pretty much any other animal, if you can no longer chew, if you cannot eat, you die. Well, this individual lived. He lived long enough for his teeth to have fallen out one by one, and for those holes in his lower jaw and upper jaw to have filled up with bone formations. So somebody must have fed him. He couldn't walk very well, which can be pretty much told from his remains. He pretty much had a lot of disabilities. I mean, he was deaf, he was half blind, he was missing an arm or leg, I can't quite remember. This individual was not particularly advantageous for the group to drag around, but they nonetheless, they evidently carried him around or, waited on him to where he survived to such an old age. Somebody went out hunting for him, must have chewed food for him and fed him, because otherwise this guy would have died. They did not really have baby formula back then. So that brings us to the theory that actually got developed here at the University of Utah when I was going to college. by our local anthropology department. And that's the grandmothering theory, where humans have acquired this appreciation for the people who are older, who past their reproductive age, because they have the knowledge and the experience to contribute to the group, one. And two, because they can take care of the infants while the parents are off doing other things, which helps the parents evolve quicker, I suppose. Maybe not go as crazy, or maybe even decide to have more children. But it's called the grandmothering theory. And there is some discussion that humans, which is one of the very few mammals who actually has such thing as menopause in females. The only other, as far as I know, as far as I remember from my studies, species that has that is marine animals, dolphins and whales. They have menopause. Every other animal is capable of reproduction until they're pretty much too old to be able to carry the infant to its term or to even take care of it. But humans stop. They stop, the female humans, obviously, not male ones. They stop being able to reproduce and then continue to live for a period of time. That's an adaptation that is very unusual. And like I said, that's where the grandmothering theory comes from. The idea is that they do that more or less on purpose because those females who stopped reproducing at a certain point in time in their lives were then able to assist their daughters with their offsprings, allowing the daughters to have more offspring and allowing them to be more successful and have more babies, pretty much to continue the trend. So even such a long time ago, these are not quite humans. These are very, very ancient representatives of what is considered our species today, but they were already capable of being kind to each other. They were already capable of feeding each other, taking care of each other, protecting their elders. I am so nervous doing this, you guys. So you're going to have to bear with me. I'm sure I'll get used to it eventually. What is human versus non-human? Several things have been suggested. I mean, people have, for example, used tool making as being a criteria for what separates humans from animals. Well, that's nice, except a lot of things make tools. Chimps make tools. They even make compound tools. Birds make tools. Again, they make compound tools. There's crows who do that. Parrots are known to do similar things. I personally have watched magpies do that outside my window. Actually, I've watched magpies sledding down the roof one time, for which they were using milk carton lids. That's a different story, but they would purposely drag them up to the top of the roof, put them in the snow track, sit down, slide back down, ad nauseum. So I'm not so sure that that's a very good dividing factor. If other animals do it, that does not make humans very special, very different from everybody else. Another one is, being bipedal. Well, I don't think that that's even a factor at all because there's a lot of things that are bipedal. There are things that are bipedal that are flying around us all the time. I have some Homo pets. They're called birds. They walk on two legs. Other apes throughout history have walked on two legs or had no correlation to modern human lineages. Kangaroos, obviously, they don't walk, they hop on two legs, and so on and so forth. So being bipedal, I don't think makes much of a difference for what makes a human a human. And I personally am of the opinion that drawing that line is a very slippery slope because I have a professor of theology that I very much respect, and he's a very religious man, but he has the following opinion. Now, I don't necessarily share it, but I think it's a good point of view. His opinion is this, we don't know whether or not Adam and Eve were walking on two legs or four legs. It doesn't matter. In the end of the day, where humanity starts does not matter. Humanity starts when people started being self-aware and thinking of themselves as people. Humanity partially probably starts with language, but that's another slippery slope, which I might cover in one of the upcoming podcasts because there's very interesting developments in the area of linguistics and especially origins of language. Current ongoing research that's really not very much published in the West, and I think is quite fascinating. So the next creature that we have, and this is enter our first true badass human. I'm not going to be able to pronounce them. Don't laugh at me. But it's Homo heidelbergensis. Dustin, help me. I can't say this. Pretty please.
I thought you nailed it, actually.
Did I really?
But I've only read it. I've never actually heard anybody else pronounce it. So
okay, so we'll just pardon my Russianisms here, but I don't think that's even a Russianism. That's just a brain freeze. Anyhow, so these creatures came about 800,000 years to 130,000 years. They were found and described in 1908. They have been found in a lot of different locations from Africa to Europe and potentially even Asian. These are truly the first important kind of breaking point creatures. They're very similar to Homo erectus, but with much, much larger heads, much larger brains. Their brain levels are approaching modern humans. Modern human brain size is about 1350 grams. These guys were right around, on average, about 1200 grams. Individual specimens have shown brain sizes that are a lot larger than that, and that probably even top modern humans' brain sizes. So these were people. I mean, they had the same brain size, and they probably were capable of similar things. It's almost certain that these guys had speech. And these guys started adapting to the cold. That's one important thing about them. These guys, we already have very clear evidence of them building structures. By structures, I don't mean palaces, but columns. Though they did build columns. I'm going to leave that one hanging for a second. We'll come back to that. But they were definitely building dwellings. They were definitely, let me see. Well, I mean, they had spears and they had compound weapons. They had compound weapons to where they would, actually connect parts together. These guys are the ancestors to pretty much all the northern branch of the human tree, and that's your Neanderthals and it's your Denisovans. They're definitely ancestors to them, and they're very parallel to what was happening at that time in Africa. Though the problem is in Africa, we don't find a lot of stuff for that time period because Africa is Africa. One, it's hot. Two, a lot of things wind up on the surface and just gets lost with time. I mean, we have a lot of findings from Africa, but we also have a lot of things that are lost. In Europe, these remains were very well preserved. These guys, there's evidence of them having these first forms of art. One particular museum collection for quite a while contained a box that nobody looked into. And when they looked at it, and it was from an excavation that was associated with I was trying to pronounce it, we're just going to call them H, okay? We're just going to leave it at that. Anyways, they were going through some of the tools and other items found. Was an excavation site, and they found their shell, the shell that had some squiggling stuff drawn on it was a shark tooth. And shark teeth had also been found at the same, site. So, and that was definitely not done for any sort of utilitarian purpose. They were not trying to drill it. They weren't trying to do anything. Somebody just thought it'd be cool to squiggle on it, and they squiggled on it. Another thing about these guys that is, interesting, they're probably the ones who kind of invented the concept of bling, not so much bling as fronting, being cool. So, for example, some of their tools that are found, they're enormous. I mean, they're 40 centimeters long, and that's just for your cutting edge. I mean, that's longer than my arm. The tool like that, you can't do anything with. I mean, your arm would fall off. It's not useful for anything other than to show it off to your homeboy and say, look, mine is bigger than yours. Also, they have some unusual tools. For example, there's examples of tools when you have a seashell that's centered. I mean, they found obviously a piece of stone that had seashell already embedded in it, or that, in one case, there's even a seahorse that's fossilized seahorse that they crafted the entire tool around. So they definitely had appreciation for things like that. They also made miniature tools, very small ones that you cannot, like 4 centimeters. I mean, that's what, 2 inches about, where to no normal person could use them for anything good. And people think that those were most likely toys, and they were toys for their kids, because in our ethnographic studies, we see that oftentimes in tribes that live more kind of hunter-gatherer lifestyle, the toys that are made for the children are basically miniature copies of the adult tools and weapons. And other things that have been found associated with these guys, tools that are obviously poorly made, but with great effort. And there's some evidence that those were probably students learning how to make something that, a tutor or a parent is showing them how to do. And that's where I think I would like to draw the line between, what we consider to be humanity and what we do not consider to be humanity. And I think that one of the distinguishing aspects, and here I'm quoting directly a Russian physical anthropologist, his name is Stanislav Drogoshevsky. Stanislav, if you hear this, thank you for all your work. You're fantastic. He's a fantastic scientist. He has also done a lot to popularize science, and he does a lot of lectures. He's super funny. I wish I could imitate just how funny he is. But, I do agree with him on the subject matter that the difference between proto-humans and humans really is the ability to be methodical, attentive, to sit and learn intentionally. Now, apes, will also learn from each other. But the mother ape does not, there's only been one documented case of a mother ape actually teaching methodically and consistently teaching an offspring how to do something. They just do their thing, and then the kids either follow it or they don't. If they're smart enough, they will follow it. If they're not smart enough, they're not going to pay attention, and that particular invention that their parent might have made in their lifetime is going to be just lost from that particular population's culture. Humans are geared to sit and teach. Humans are also geared to sit and learn. And that's something that I think distinguishes them greatly. And I think all of the species of humans, I'm not going to speak about Homo erectus, though I have my suspicions, but all the other, branchiations of the later humans, whether it's Neanderthals, Denisovans, or the unknown population that has, according to our geneticists, has contributed to the African populations that they don't know who that lineage was. I think that they all had that ability to sit and learn, and that's what really furthered human advancement over all other animals out there within the primate group, especially the ape group. And I think that feeds very nicely into the grandmothering theory, because your grandmothers or grandfathers only have value to you as a group if they have something to teach you. So they mostly associated with the Ashel culture, but they were the first group with some signs of switching over to the Mustia culture, which is a later one and is more commonly associated with Neanderthal populations. This is pretty much it as far as the main groups of kind of old school science. Now, there's been some interesting discoveries that have taken place since most of us have been in high school. And first and foremost of them is the Denisov cave. And Denisov is actually a last name, just in case you wonder what the heck the word Denisovan means. These poor guys don't even have like a technical, they might now, but nobody ever uses it. Nobody knows their Latin name. Everybody just calls them Denisovans. Well, that's because they were found in a cave where notorious robber and the criminal was hiding somewhere around 17th century in Russian part of Siberia. And that's why it was known as the Denisov cave. Therefore, these guys are known as Denisovans. Now, that cave has been known for a while. It's still being excavated, and there's still new information coming out of this cave. Some of it is very recent, just a few months ago, and it's super exciting. But what was originally found there, in the debris, was phalange of a finger, just basically a little finger bone from a pinky, from a little girl, and a tooth. And because it's it's in the colder regions, and DNA preserves a lot better in the cold. I mean, in the heat, it just falls apart very rapidly. The scientists who got excited about it, they were able to get DNA out of out of that one tooth and out of that finger bone, and they were able to see that this was a DNA unlike anything they have seen before, because this happened in 2010. I mean, they were originally discovered in 2008, but in 2010 it kind of became scientific canon. So now we know and heard about this third unknown creature. So we have our modern Homo sapiens. In the general science, we have the Neanderthals, which have been known since previous century and the century before that. But now we have this another new group that seems to have been closely. It's a runner-up with the other two major species, if not the more advanced group. I mean, there's some evidence that these guys might have been more culturally advanced than both Neanderthals and modern Homo sapiens. There is some evidence of them using jewelry, for example, nothing fancy, but some sort of decorative items on their body. Their brain capacity, just like Neanderthals, was a lot larger than modern humans. I mean, actually, our brains are kind of shrinking, because I think we have to remember less. When you go foraging and you close a supermarket and you don't have to remember the game trails and you don't have to figure out how to get this bison down before the bison gets you down, you don't tend to use your brain as much, and then you start using Google a lot and you don't need to remember stuff. And then your phone gets, the auto memory feature, and you no longer remember the phone numbers, and your brain slowly starts to shrink. Which reminds me of one more subject that I did not bother to bring up, and that is the stomach size, or rather the gut size, not the stomach. The stomach is the stomach. But if you look at a gorilla, if you look at a cow, they have huge bellies, and that's because they have lots of intestines in there. Because the rougher the food you eat is, the more intestines you tend to need to digest that food. Especially if you eat hard plant matter, therefore gorillas with their really big bellies, and cows where they have to be able to digest this more or less undigestible, celluloid, harsh, woody stuff. Now, advent of cooking, is associated with as early as the Homo erectus, and those are first normal-looking humans. There's actually recent publications which speculate, I'm not sure how much I buy this, that they might have accidentally or intentionally boiled meat in hot springs, and maybe, this is pure speculation now. I'm quoting publication, but it's not, peer-reviewed publication. But that they might have come across carcasses floating in hot springs, because there's some evidence that due to the volcanic activity in the time period in certain areas of the Erectus habitat, there might have been more, especially in Eastern Europe, there might have been more hot spring sources than there are today. I think that there might have been multiple ways that early hominids came across cooked meat. Anything from a forest fire to the hot spring theory. But bottom line is, if you cook your food, it's easy to digest. It's a lot easier to swallow. Humans originally were not designed to eat meat. Humans are not predators. We're not predators. Ancestors, some of them went towards being omnivorous, but very, very few apes are truly carnivorous. And the only truly carnivorous ape really today, as far as we know, was Neanderthals. And even that is kind of a questionable fact. So modern humans are probably the most carnivorous monkey there is. Ape, sorry, you're right. Again, monkey is a term of affection. Sorry, people. So basically, the moment people started cooking food, their guts started shrinking. That's why we have our nice flat bellies today that we so like on our magazine covers. That I think that one of the ancestors would have seen a girl with a belly like that, and he would have been super concerned for how emaciated she is. Actually, if you look at our dogs and cats who eat processed food, they are going through the same evolutionary process a lot quicker, because processed food is basically the same thing. You're feeding them pre-digested food. It's not only cooked, it's pre-digested. They don't need the intestinal length, which kind of worries me as a little side spiel, because if humans go extinct and poor dogs and cats wind up on the street, they are not only going to be all fixed and unable to breathe, they're not going to be able to eat any normal food. I know friends whose dogs have died from eating a piece of meat, and that's not good. But that's neither here nor there. So anyway, the size of the belly has shrunk significantly. The cooking was a really big factor, because meat is much more nutritious than plant food, and cooked meat is easier to digest. You can eat, consume a lot more of it with more nutritious value and less negative, harmful elements that your body has to work against. And it feeds your brain, and that's what most likely allowed later human species to grow to larger brains, for which people paid with problem that humans have with childbirth. Most animals are able to manage their childbirth just fine without midwives or doctors. Very few human populations are capable of doing that. There's some ethnographic evidence that some pygmies might be capable of that. I'm not sure how much of that is physical and how much of it is just circumstantial. If you live in that sort of situation, you don't have a midwife, if you can't deliver yourself, you're probably going to die. But humans are notoriously known for having problems with child delivery because of the very large brain size. Because, the baby needs to stay, inside the mother long enough to develop the brain to an optimal size, but not too big to where it cannot get to the opening. And there's some evidence that Neanderthals particularly had even harder time with this, because their physical structure was not allowing for as much mobility. And some people hypothesize that might be one of the things that contributed to their disappearance. But that's something we'll talk about in the next podcast. So the Denisovans, they contributed to modern human population, but there is quite a large amount of, by large, of course, it's fractions. We're talking about 2%, 3%, but it's found in a lot of Asian population. Basically, anybody who migrated out of Africa and is not a part of a population that migrated out and then returned to Africa, has some degree of Denisovan admixture, and some populations have a larger degree then less, or some have lesser, but it appears that this population, this particular branch of the human tree was probably a little bit more advanced than everybody around them. We don't know what they look like. Nobody has ever seen a skull or skeleton or anything other than that little finger bone, or that tooth. Or they've found several other items since then. Actually, this excavation season, they just came up with a couple more finds. But one thing that they did find, and it's interesting enough, is that Denisovans definitely have mixed with both Neanderthals and humans. They actually have done DNA analysis on some of the new finds. This is this year's information, and they found hybrids that were second generation, for example. So you have somebody, whose mom was Neanderthal, dad was Denisovan, and then a couple generations back in their DNA, you again have the same sort of admixture. So these mixing events evidently happened a lot. And again, that's something we're going to talk about in depth when I get to Neanderthals, whom I personally really like and respect, and who are not extinct, damn it. They're not, they live among us, I promise. And Denisovans too. So anyway, these were populations that, even though they significantly differed from humans, we don't know how morphologically, but as far as DNA goes, they were very different. Were nonetheless able to breed with the anatomically modern humans and have healthy offspring that were able to breed themselves. So then we have a couple of weird side species that even much more modern finds than the traditional breakdown of the human family tree. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about the hobbit. It was found on the island of Flores, Indonesian island. And these were really weird little creatures. When they were originally found, there was a huge debate among scientists whether or not these were just some deformed individuals with one form of, congenital illness or another form of congenital illness, because these guys were very recent. I mean, they, existed. There was originally, they gave them very recent dates, something like, I think, almost 10,000 years. Right now, most scientists are talking about, conservative scientists, Roboshevsky in particular, whom I respect and trust very much, is talking about 50,000 years. Regardless, that's pretty recent. These guys were small. They had very small brains. Their brains were like 420 grams. That's smaller than even, their ancestors. That's smaller than a chimp's. They had weird structure. They had very small shrunken heads. They made tools, but they're fairly primitive tools, but they hunted stuff. Now, they lived on an island. This island was populated by two kinds of predators, three kinds counting these people. So Homo florensis, also known as the Hobbit, lived on the island that they shared with large carnivorous lizards and large carnivorous birds. Large, comparatively speaking. For us, they probably would have not been that huge. But there were also very giant rats that could be easily caught and eaten. There were giant tortoises that were caught and eaten, miniature elephants, and other weird island species, which tends to happen a lot on an island when you have a species caught in a small space. Birds tend to stop flying if there's not a lot of predators to eat them. Elephants and other large animals like deer tend to become very small, and the small animals tend to become huge. That's when you get your enormous sized ducks, and enormous sized tortoises and other rats and other such things. So these guys were living there peacefully, and nobody knows whom they descended from. There's some, speculation that there might have been a population of Homo erectus, Erectus, not sure how you say that. Anyway, Homo erectus that wound up on that island at some point in time, and that's a big question mark, because this is an island that was never connected to a continent. How these guys got there in a quantity large enough to be able to continue to be there is a good question. But they think that their ancestors might have been either Homo erectus or some other random unknown human species, which now that they suspect that there was a lot of. But they were stuck on an island, and so what happens when you're a mammal stuck on an island and you're carnivorous, you start shrinking. You start becoming smaller, and when you shrink, you don't shrink proportionately. Usually one part of the body becomes smaller and another part becomes bigger. In this case, their head shrunk. Their structure of their feet, of their hands is very different from anything else scientists have seen. They have found enough of these remains now to definitely classify it as unquestionable species. And they existed there until about the time when, modern humans came through that region. And when you have a situation when you have a little people living on a little island, then you have humans coming through. And suddenly, poof, there's no more little people and there's humans living on that island. There's a good chance that they did not do so well in competition. And actually, locals have some legends about small people who didn't speak normal human or people language that they, at first they even traded with or interacted with in some form, and then they started doing inappropriate things like stealing their kills or trying to attack their children. And so the locals chased them all into a cave and covered that cave with a bunch of boulders, set it on fire, and that was the end of the little people. That's a great legend, and it would be very interesting to tie it to the idea of these an ancestral memory of these little people who once did actually live there. The problem is that we have the exact same legend everywhere from Siberia to, South and North America to all over Asia. There's oftentimes a general traveling kind of, kind of clipping of a mythos of this other humans that got chased into a cave and burned there alive. Regardless, there's no more hobbits, unfortunately. Some people like to think that they lived very recently, that they lived even long past the pyramids were built. We don't know how recently they disappeared, but they're not with us anymore, just like all the other alternative humanities, because wherever humans go, they tend to not leave anything else behind. And we're lucky if they leave their own kind behind, pretty much. So the other interesting, so I'm going to actually jump back in time because I'm skipped this, guys. So Homo naledi, and I'm not, if you follow at all any sort of archaeological stuff, anthropological stuff, I mean, this was a big, noise factor some years ago. But this was a very weird subspeciation of humans. They coexisted with Homo erectus. They lived in South Africa, and these guys were truly weird. They only found in one place, in a cave, where there's a bunch of them. And they obviously did not live in that cave. That is a cave where somebody dragged the bodies and dumped them down a well. That's how the scientists found them. There was actually some people exploring some underwater caves. They came to a dead end, went a little bit further, turned a corner, and found a ton of skeletons there, called anthropologists. Because in South Africa, they know that, anthropological finds are important, and, they're pretty good at following through on that. So they found a total 15 individuals, last time I checked, in the Rising Star Cave system in South Africa. And these guys were weird. They had really long arms. They had absolutely modern formation of feet. Their fingers were more curved than any other hominid species. Their brain size was right at the borderline to where they may have not made tools. There's some supposition that this may have been a burial attempt, or at least what they call a sanitary burial, to where you just get rid of the dead bodies in your campsite so predators don't come and eat them. But regardless, there was nothing else found in there. It was obviously not an area that was habituated by anybody. But these guys were small, and they coexisted right next to the Homo erecti who lived on the open plains. So there's even some suggestion that these might have been unique cave-dwelling sort of little off-branch of humans, kind of from your scary science fiction movies. And they may have lived only in those two caves because there's only two caves that could join that they've ever been found in. So it's interesting to think that we had little nocturnal cave-dwelling humans that hid away from all the other humans. And finally, very recent find, and this is like literally within last month or two, in the Philippines, they found other very different, and this was published in the journal Nature, they found yet another miniature hominid species that they think might have been another offshoot of the erecti that got stranded here and there. They're very small. They have weird adaptations. They have adapted to island life. They adapted to living in territories that are limited in resources. They, not much of them been found, but there's been parts of different individuals found. So a bone from one and tooth from another one. These guys, there's some evidence that they were hunting and butchering rhinoceri in that location. Now, we're talking about miniature island ones, not the big scary ones. And some stone tools were found that were dating around to back when these creatures lived on that island, and there's no evidence of any other human-like creatures living there that could have been making those tools. And these guys lived somewhere between 70,000 and 70,000 and 50,000 years back. So also very recent. And actually, this is not the only weird island species or evidence of species found in that region. In Indonesia, in general, there's many islands that have evidence of either human or hominid or some sort of creature habituation. There are tools that are found on multiple islands. There are finds of remains on multiple islands that have not been published. But there's a pretty good understanding among the scientists that there were probably many of these miniature island-dwelling groups of very different and unique human-like creatures that were miniature, or in some cases maybe not miniature, but that disappeared fairly recently and were able to live in isolation pretty much until, anatomically modern humans came to the area and ate them all. And yes, they likely ate them all, and that's something we're going to touch on for, further podcasts, because eating your neighbor was kind of the norm pretty much throughout human history, as well as sleeping with your neighbor. I mean, it was toss up one or the other. So that's pretty much all I wanted to say in this particular podcast. If anybody has any questions, comments, suggestions, I'm here.
I would point out one thing about Erectus. Probably.
Can you guys hear him?
Can you hear me?
I can hear. I don't know. Can you hear my audio?
Okay, who's speaking?
Ryan.
Ryan, I can hear you great.
Oh, okay.
Can you hear David though when he talks? Because, yeah, okay.
Yes.
Erectus was probably, and probably all of them were eventually the later things, but there's a good evidence they were persistent hunters and could run and run.
Yeah, evolved for running. You're right. I didn't say anything. Yeah, because that body shape, that's the first, well, Ergastus really is the first one, but once you get past Homo habilis, they all get suddenly very long. I mean, think about like a professional runner in the Olympic sports. You have somebody with very long limbs, very skinny, very, streamlined for long time endurance running. I mean, the humans in general are built to run for very, very long time, long periods of time and long distances. Sorry, we have cleaning crew here in the office, and they're making a lot of vacuum type noises.
Oh, understood.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I have anything to add. I'm still coming through okay on your end?
Yeah, I can hear you great.
Okay, excellent. Хорошо. I don't think I have anything to add, although I did find it interesting, your postulation, I guess you could say, about what makes a modern human more distinct from, other species. And of course, you don't want to touch on the religious part, terribly. But the way that we do treat our elders, and of course, not just our elders, but also how we started to treat our dead and other things like that. And of course, the emergence of symbols. I assume that has something to do with our evolution into what we consider to be modern humans. It's certainly not something I'm an expert on, but might be interesting in the future to discuss.
Definitely, and and it's a subject that is really kind of one of those most interesting subjects to debate, because, the treatment of the dead, for example, and even evolution of symbols is seen in other species, and species very distantly removed from humans. Elephants, for example, are known to return to the spots where the dead ones are lying and repeat certain, recognition gestures. I have personally seen a sugar glider treat, and deceased partner in a manner that would be uniquely. I mean, this is not empirical observation. That was not a scientific experiment. But when you see an animal beating its head repeatedly against the cage, stroking the head of the dead creature, I mean, in a way that is very different than they during life. I mean, I think that, to me, I think that humans are very different from every other animal. Absolutely. Humans are completely outstanding, different species. So is an ape. So is my linear parakeet back at home. They're all very outstanding, and they're all at the top of their evolutionary tree, because you know what? They're still here. If you survive to today and you're still surviving, guess what? You're the best you could be. And so for me, I personally don't believe in a hard line between humans and animals. I think that it's a gradation. But again, that's a matter of belief and not science, really.
Yeah, well, everybody's entitled to their own beliefs anyways. I personally do not really see animals as being lesser or greater than humans in general. That's just me, but that's a personal thing anyways. But it also goes back, I think that was a great point that you made also about the tool making and even complex tools, because I have seen coons, bears, cats. I've seen them all figure out how to use tools, and they can even make them in some cases, especially bears and coons. I
didn't know that. That's really interesting, actually. I've never observed that particularly, but I haven't. Bear, what's your opinion on that?
Bears using tools?
No, I'm asking Dustin here.
Oh, sorry.
That's what my nickname is to Julie. So is Bear. But yeah, I'm just to weigh in really quickly. I'm really glad that you stayed away from defining humans as, having the ability to make tools, especially compound tools, because there's so many different animals that can do that. The same thing, I've heard the argument about reasoning, for example, and, if you've ever watched a coyote or a fox, they absolutely can problem solve. And, the same can be said for, hyenas and wolves too. If you ever watched them trap an animal, certainly there are a lot of other species that have those same abilities that we do. So
I've seen my canary problem solve. When I was a little kid, I had a family of canaries, and when the mother and the babies flew out the window in the middle of Moscow, I sent the dad out to go get them, and he did. So, what I'm saying, and that's a finch who does not have much, frankly.
Yeah, I mean, even an animal as ungainly as a moose, they are the number one jailbreakers in zoos, because they can figure things out.
I don't doubt that. I'm sad that we don't have our moose anymore. I had to help bury her, but boy, what a wily critter! Boy, you don't want to be on the wrong end of a moose.
When we get to Siberia, guys, and when we get to the northern part of Russia, we're going to talk about the great kingdom of Perm, with their warrior knight on top of their armored moose, and their sleds with reindeer. That's something that nobody, I bet you, has ever heard.
That sounds fun. I look forward to that.
Fighting the Mongols of all the people. They were fighting the Mongols, and they won. So yeah, it's going to be an interesting conversation.
There was another thing I wanted to weigh in on this podcast. This is kind of like your pilot. I can't remember what it was though, but yeah, it was early. It was something you were talking about early on, but it's not coming to me. I'm sure that if I remember it and I think it's important, I'll
bring it up next time.
But yeah, that's a lot of great material that you covered, though. I don't really think that I have very much to add to it. I basically learned a lot of new things.
Awesome.
So wonderful. I liked it. But yeah, I don't have anything else to interject.
Dustin, David?
I just would touch on all humanity and what the definition is. That is very, very open to interpretation, and it depends on what you're looking at. When I was taking anthropology classes half a lifetime ago, it was all about tool tradition, but that's just one thing. Now we find more and more kids using spears to hunt the little primate.
Yeah. Well, and I was saving that discussion really for the next episode, because I adore Neanderthals. I think that they're awesome. I think that they were much better than the modern humans. If I call you a Neanderthal, that's a compliment.
It's not an insult then.
No, it's absolutely a compliment. So I was going to say, because I think that human tendency to strip Neanderthals of their humanity, so to speak, is funny, hysterical, and very persistent. And that's something I was going to address in the next podcast, because I think it's very interesting how modern people are trying to account for their genocide,
I think that would be a great topic, although I don't know how much empirical evidence that we really have to prove anything on. It has been suggested to me that Neanderthals were probably actually quite compassionate as people went.
There's a lot of empirical evidence, actually. There's a lot of empirical, there's my speculations, which I will specify as such, and then there is specific hard evidence. There's more and more evidence that Neanderthals were quite advanced, and that they contributed much more to at least the European and Asian lineages than previously thought. I mean, and even those 3 to 5% that the geneticists talk about don't account for culture, mythology. They don't account, and there's evidence of even those items. So that's something that I'm really excited to talk about, because I really like Neanderthals. I think they're awesome. So, yep.
Okay, well, I look forward to that.
Me too. Well, thank you everybody for joining. And again, thank you, Morwaen, if you're going to be watching this, because I know you're going to be watching this. Thank you guys from the Poni-Radiow, and thank you guys from the, Scientists Against Myth, from the, anthropology, I can't pronounce it. Anthropogenesis.ru, whose material I also used for this, Roboshevsky, Sokolov, and multiple others, talented scientists whose names I'm not going to mention right now and whose material I'm probably going to keep falling back on over and over. So Zhitnyov is another one I remember. So thank you guys. You do awesome work. Please keep doing the work you can. And I'm going to do what I can to, forward some of your material to English speaking audience as well. So I think it's awesome to reach as many people as possible. So thank you, everyone. Take care. Bye.
All right. Be well.